Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. My name is Marissa, and I'm here with my colleague Megan. We are coming to you from the UConn Health Sciences Library, which is located at UConn Health. That's the University of Connecticut's academic medical center, located in lovely, partly sunny Farmington, Connecticut today. Low humidity. It's very nice. Today we're gonna be talking about a webinar we developed on data management for evidence synthesis. And then we're also going to go into those topics in a bit more detail to hopefully give this audience a new way to frame this kind of work. And then we'll wrap up with some tips on organizing your files and improving your workflow. So to introduce ourselves a bit further, my name is Marissa Iverson. I'm the research support librarian, and I'm joined today by Megan Benfield, who is our data and systems librarian. Our email addresses are available there, and our slides are available on the conference platform. So for after this session, we hope that you will all be able to recognize how data management principles can be applied to evidence synthesis work. You'll be able to identify the data-related requirements of Prisma, and lastly, apply file naming and version control best practices to your own file organization. For a bit of background, this past February was Megan's second Love Data Week with our library. And rather than offering her usual wonderful slate of data classes and webinars, she reached out to a bunch of us across our library asking if anyone else wanted to partner on, aspects of data and our own work and come up with some new programming. So I jumped at the opportunity, and together we put together a 30-minute session on data management for systematic reviews. I taught the actual session, but it borrowed heavily from content Megan had already developed for other webinars. We ran it once in February during Love Data Week, and then again in April. And between the two sessions, we had 6 attendees total. The webinar itself covered applying Prisma guidelines for tracking evidence synthesis data and reproducibility, talked about comparing screening and data extraction options, and using file management and version control best practices. We recorded the February version of this session and uploaded it to our library streaming library. And when I submitted the slides last week, it had been viewed 9 times, but we're actually up to 10 now. So that's exciting. So next, I'm going to hand it over to Megan to talk about data management and the data lifecycle.
Next slide, Marissa. Okay, so there's two core ideas that are really grounding this discussion between data management and evidence synthesis projects, and that's transparency and organization. These are two important principles in the world of data management, though not the only ones. In a broader data management context, we're also concerned with things like data sharing. For data to be shared and reused, it needs to be well organized, clearly documented, and these practices directly support reproducibility and allow for future researchers to understand and build on the work. In evidence synthesis, transparency and reproducibility are not just goals, but they are formal expectations reflected in standards like Prisma. Meeting these expectations depends on strong organization and documentation practices, including consistent workflows and clear tracking of decisions. Then, as projects scale, especially in large collaborations or in living systematic reviews that require updating, these practices become essential for maintaining consistency and ensuring the work remains reproducible over time. Next slide. So if we think about evidence synthesis then as a data life cycle or a data pipeline, we can see how the project moves through stages like searching, screening, extraction, synthesis, and reporting, and where that data is collected, refined, and transformed at each step. Search results become screening data sets, which then become included studies and structured extraction tables. Because each stage builds on the previous one, those decisions need to be traceable and workflows consistent across the entire process and across the entire team. Framing it this way highlights that data management isn't separate from the research, it's embedded in how the data is collected, transformed, and passed through the workflow, ultimately shaping how reproducible and reliable the final outputs are. Next slide.
So next, I'm going to go into how these data requirements and this data workflow fits into Prisma, as Megan just described. So as this audience is familiar with Prisma, transparency and reproducibility play a huge role in our evidence synthesis work. And when it comes to Prisma, several checklist items touch on the data lifecycle that Megan just showed. So in your methods content, you can think about your searching methods, aka checklist items 6 and 7, our information sources and search strategies, as really just being part of documentation. Data collection, which are checklist items 10A and 10B, or data items. These reflect a standardized workflow and standardized instruments. And with synthesis and assessments, checklist items 12 through 15, which includes a whole bunch of good stuff like effect measures, synthesis methods, reporting bias, and certainty assessments. Again, research, this is all showing how your data was identified, collected, and analyzed. And reporting out on all of these elements makes your work transparent and reproducible. Going down the checklist further, when we get to the results content, again, screening, checklist items 16 and 17, your study selection and characteristics. This goes back to documentation. And the results of your syntheses, assessments, checklist items 18 through 22, risk of bias, studies results, statistical syntheses, analyses, and certainty of evidence. This all goes back to protocol compliance, documentation, standardized tests, and instruments. And again, this just all goes back to transparency and reproducibility, really important topics in data management. Lastly, think about other applications or other extensions of Prisma. There are data concerns in Prisma for abstracts, Prisma for protocols. Scope and reviews obviously have different requirements and more, obviously there's more extensions that may apply to your project. And just another way to frame the Prisma flow diagram, it's really just a workflow documentation. And we'll go back to Megan for file naming and version control.
Okay. Can you go to the next slide, Marissa? So one of the most practical ways to support this workflow is through file naming and version control. The goal is to build file names with the most relevant pieces of information for your project. What we can think of as critical metadata. That might include things like project identifiers, workflow stage, date or version number, all elements that help you immediately understand what a file is and where it fits in the process. These choices should also align with how your project is organized. A clear folder structure can provide context, so file names don't always need to repeat information that's already captured at the folder level. Version control is especially important, especially in cloud-based environments. Many of our tools now use autosave features, meaning new edits overwrite earlier work. Creating a copy before making substantial changes helps preserve prior versions. While some tools allow you to restore earlier versions, that functionality can be limited, so intentional versioning is still important. With that in mind, the next few examples show how these ideas can be applied in different parts of an evidence synthesis project. Next slide. So to start, I have an example here for your article PDFs. The goal is to make files easy to recognize and distinguish at a glance. These examples show how file names can be shortened and standardized while still capturing key details like the author, year, and topic. In evidence synthesis projects, articles are often managed in reference managers, so if a tool assigns a unique ID, that identifier can also be incorporated into the file name, especially when exporting or sharing PDFs outside of the system. So, for example, here you can have the first author's last name, the year of publication, short title, and the journal. But if you are using a tool that assigns a unique ID, then maybe you would just provide the unique ID information and then the first author and year. Either way, you want something that's going to be easily identifiable within your folder. Next slide. Then, for your data sets, so again, in evidence synthesis, your data sets can refer to several types of files. This will be your search results, your abstract or full text screening decisions, or the structured data extraction forms. Because these files are actively edited and updated, file names need to reflect both their role in the workflow and their version. These examples show how including elements like project identifiers or the review stage and dates or version numbers can help track progress and differentiate between iterations of the same data set. So I recommend maybe using a project short title plus the data stage plus the date edited. So in this case, I have a diabetes systematic review project. This data set, the CSV file, is specifically for the data extraction stage, and it was edited on May 15th of 2026. Next slide, please. And finally, we also have files for your manuscripts and your reports. So file naming plays a key role in version control, in particular when we're dealing with manuscript files. These examples illustrate how file names can capture the progression of a document by including elements like the project name, version number, date, and editor initials. This makes it easier to identify the most current version and track how the document evolves over time, particularly in collaborative writing environments. This is also an example where you can see I have a version number or a date in the after example, but in the before I use final and revised. When you're using these kind of generic terms, it can be hard to identify what the most recent version of a document is. And by adding the initial of the editing author, you're able to see the progression of the files, and have conversations of if there is a change made that you have questions about, you know who to take those questions to. And next slide.
All right, so I'm just going to wrap up with some takeaways. We hope that adopting best practices for data management, file naming, version control can help with your organization and workflow. I know ever since I learned about this content that Megan put together, it's helped me tremendously. I can't tell you how many final manuscripts I got sitting in my files. We also hope that framing evidence synthesis work as just another type of research with its own standards compliance, its own planning needs, can help legitimize the way that we do things, maybe to faculty or students or residents. Perhaps this framing it as a data concern or framing it within the terms of the research life cycle may help explain why we do the things we do, and why we're such sticklers about sticking to certain things. It's also, this kind of language falls more into researcher speak. And again, that might just help convey why we're doing what we're doing, why they need to track certain things, why we document certain things. That just might bridge that divide between librarians and our systematic review or scoping review or evidence synthesis teams better. And just lastly, coming from a research support librarian who does a lot of evidence synthesis projects, I encourage you to collaborate with your data services colleagues. We often work in separate lanes on separate tasks, possibly in separate departments, but there's just a lot of potential for working together and collaborating together on workshops and webinars and more. And thank you so much. No UConn presentation would be complete, in my opinion, without a picture of our good boy Jonathan. He's UConn's live mascot, Jonathan Jonathan 15. If you need another takeaway to have a goofy husky in your social feeds, he's at Jonathan the Husky on Instagram. And thank you so much. We look forward to any questions as we move into our Q&A.